I've been presenting to Australian financial institutions in Sydney the last couple of days. When I left on Sunday to go to Sydney, when I came into the airport, there was about a fifth of the number of people in the airport that there usually is when I make that flight. The flight that I was on was cancelled because there weren't enough people on it, and it was combined with another flight an hour and a half later. When I came back yesterday, the flight ahead of my flight to Brisbane had been cancelled to combine the passengers with my flight so there was enough people on it. When I presented firstly on Monday, I must say that about 3 out of 5 of the people of the firms I presented to would have been prepared to declare an Australian recession on the day. So I began to analyse it, both in terms of the historical record and then in terms of the data that we've seen so far. What I argued was that the closest replica that we can see to these events are the Asian financial crisis in 1997. In 1997, the second largest economy in the world and the largest economy in Asia was Japan. In 1997, Japan went into deep recession, as did most of the other countries in Southeast Asia. And it was overwhelmingly forecast by the overwhelming majority of economists interviewed in the Australian Financial Review, there would be a major recession in Australia. There were 2 people who thought that wouldn't occur, and one of those was from the Reserve Bank of Australia, Warwick McKibben, and the other one was me. And our argument was that the cuts that the Fed was making and the falling international interest rates would allow Australians to import capital more cheaply. And we turned out to be right. And by the end of the year, there was no recession, and growth in the Australian economy was better than it had been anticipated at the beginning of the year. That's not no record is identical. And when people were talking about the people I presented to, for example, they were dealing with a different reality. Most of them were had come to the organisational understanding that it was almost, whether they thought this was true, it was almost inevitable that many of them would have to be at home for an extended period sometime in the next year in terms of household quarantine. And as a result of that, many of them talked about building up their home computer bases so that they could work from home for extended periods of time. So it was it's very real for these people. Apart from the argument from the historical argument on the 1997 recession, I also looked at the data that I talked about 5 weeks ago in the podcast that I did on Wuhan coronavirus at the end of January. And in that, what I said was that I thought the impact upon the Australian economy was in 2 parts. Firstly, last year there was 772,000 Chinese tourists come to Australia, and none of them would come. And that reduced Australian GDP by 0.5% of GDP. In addition to that, if we added up all of the income that was gained from Chinese full-fee education, that was an extra 1% of GDP. But I had noted that a little under half of those students had arrived, and so I thought, when I did that podcast, that the negative effect on the Australian economy would be 1% of GDP, and I forecast that the RBA would cut interest rates, which they since have done. Turns out that a lot of additional students came to Australia by spending 2 weeks in third countries such as Thailand. And so now I would estimate the negative effect upon the Australian economy as 0.75% of GDP, 0.75% of GDP. Now the Australian economy is 2 trillion Australian dollars, so that adds up to $15 billion. Now what's really interesting to me is on top of the RBA rate cut we've had, and I, like most economists, believe that will be further cuts by the RBA, we see the beginning of a stimulus package which is talked about as around about 10 billion. So what I think is that as it becomes apparent that there is a fall in demand in the Australian economy, what is happening is that the government or the RBA is stepping up to provide stimulus. So I think they're filling the gaps as the gaps appear. Now those gaps may be much larger by the time we get to the year, but I think the government will fill the gaps as they appear. My conclusion as a result of those presentations is that I actually swung a view, I think, towards the view that there would be no Australian recession this year. I think growth will be above 2%. It may not be the 2.8% I have on the presentation. I think the governments both in Australia and the US will act in time. We see Trump providing larger stimulus packages. The one thing we can rely on, and what was really important in 1997, was the stimulus coming from the United States. And as we know, the only thing that Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi can agree on in the United States is they both want to spend more money. So I think there will be significant stimulus coming from the United States, but I think there are unique difficulties. By the way, in talking to people about comparisons, historically comparisons, no one anymore is really talking about SARS. They're talking about the Hong Kong flu of 1968 or the Asian flu of 1957, which was the first time that influenza type A reached Australia. I think the result of that, my understanding of the historical record is the death rate was about 0.61%. And of course, the comparison with the Spanish flu at the end of the Great War. Try as I might, when I look back at that data, it's very difficult to differentiate a specific effect of those epidemics in 1968, which was a very strong year in the economy, in 1957, which was followed by the 60s boom, or in the Spanish flu, which was struck Australia in 1919 and 1920, which was, of course, followed by the boom of the 1920s. Well, particularly in the United States it was, and in France it was. So it's very difficult to isolate out those effects. I think we have a series of unique problems. I think our government, and particularly the US government, is stepping up in response to those problems, and I think you won't see a recession in the US and you won't see a recession in Australia, but governments will have done a lot of work to make sure that is true.